Hello! You're on the Storm to Truth channel. Enjoy your watching. Michael has always been a man who strives for order. As the owner and chef of a popular restaurant, one of the most famous health food restaurants in the city, his days were filled with careful planning, precision, and passion. He was a self-made millionaire who became famous in the culinary world not only for his dishes, but also for his commitment to healthy eating and sustainability. People respected him, chefs, critics, and customers alike. But today, as he sat in a quiet corner of a local bar after a long day, he wasn't thinking about recipes or his next big venture. His thoughts were far away from here. There was a familiar hum in the bar. The clinking of glasses, the quiet murmur of conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter provided a cozy backdrop for Michael, who had chosen a window seat. He didn't come here to be noticed. It was his way to relax, to let the weight of the day dissolve into the amber glow of the evening. His restaurant might have been a success, but Michael was a man who treasured these moments of solitude when no one demanded anything of him, when he could just breathe. He didn't notice her at first, but she must have been sitting nearby. His thoughts were disturbed by her laughter. Soft at first, then louder. It sounded like it was coming from someone who didn't take life too seriously. He looked around and saw her. Sophia. Her presence was impossible to ignore. Her dark hair framed her face in waves, and her smile seemed to catch the light in the room. She wasn't loud or trying to draw attention to herself, but people noticed her anyway. Michael couldn't help but smile when he saw how animated she was talking to the bartender. It was her energy, infectious, full of life, that drew him in. Before he knew it, their eyes met, and she smiled at him in a way that made his heart race. "Rough day?" she asked, dropping into the seat next to him without hesitation. It felt like they'd known each other for years, not strangers in a bar. There was a casual warmth in her voice, the kind that made Michael feel as if he could let his guard down for just a moment. "Something like that," he replied, feeling the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. Long day at work. They exchanged pleasantries, telling each other what they were doing. Michael learned that Sophia was a freelance graphic designer who liked the flexibility of her work. She moved through life with an easy grace, unencumbered by the structured routine on which Michael had built his world. He told her about his restaurant, his clean eating philosophy, and how he had built a business from the ground up. Sophia seemed genuinely interested, asking him questions that went beyond the usual small talk. But the more they talked, the more Michael realized that it wasn't just the conversation that had him hooked, but she herself. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her laughter seemed to light up the room. He snuggled up to her, wanting to hear more, wanting to keep that connection. They talked for hours. The bar, once noisy, was slowly quieting down and the customers were leaving. But neither of them noticed it. Their conversation flowed casually, covering everything from the quirks of city life to their shared love of food. Michael had met women before who admired his success, who enjoyed being around the owner of a popular restaurant. But with Sophia, it was different. She wasn't impressed by his accolades or his money. She just listened, and he liked that. By the end of the evening, Michael couldn't deny it anymore. He wanted to see her again. When they exchanged numbers, Sophia smiled playfully at him. "I had a good time, Michael. Let's do it again sometime." That evening, Michael left the bar with a sense of excitement he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure exactly what it was about Sophia, but something told him this was the start of something special. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Sophia after that night at the bar. No matter how busy his life was, as he ran his restaurant and oversaw the development of a new menu, his thoughts kept returning to her. That laugh, her lively energy, the way she seemed to sweep through life with a confidence that both fascinated and disarmed him. A few days after their first meeting, he sent her a text message suggesting dinner. To his relief, she agreed without hesitation, and they arranged to meet that Friday at a small, cozy restaurant in one of the quieter parts of town. Although Michael was more than capable of preparing a gourmet dinner himself, the idea of being a guest for once, relaxing, and just enjoying the evening was very appealing. When Friday night came, Michael found himself unexpectedly nervous. He wasn't used to feeling this way, but there was something about Sophia that made him want to impress her, even though she didn't seem like the kind of woman who was won over by fancy dinners or high-profile connections. She greeted him with the same easy smile, and his nerves immediately began to melt. They ordered wine, and the conversation flowed as naturally as the first night they met. Sophia was full of stories about her freelance work, her adventures in the city, and the strange but wonderful people she encountered on a daily basis. Michael was fascinated not only by what she said, but how she said it. She had a knack for making every moment seem light, fun, and effortless. Michael, in turn, shared part of his own story. How he built his restaurant from the ground up, how he went from a small takeout stand at farmers markets to one of the most successful healthy food restaurants in the city. He talked about his love of creating dishes that were not only delicious but also good for the body, dishes that made people feel alive. Sophia seemed to appreciate his passion, even teasing him for being too technical when talking about nutrient-rich ingredients. "You really light up when you talk about it," she said, smiling over her glass of wine. "It's nice to see someone who is so passionate about what they do." They spent a few hours talking, laughing, and sharing stories until the restaurant began to close for the night. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Michael felt like he had known Sophia for years. There was an ease between them that he had never experienced before. As they walked down the dimly lit street, Sophia turned to him. "You know," she began, "I didn't expect this." "Didn't expect what?" asked Michael, looking at her curiously. "This," she said, gesturing between them. "I've gone on dates before, met people, but this is different. Good different." Michael smiled. "Yeah, I know what you mean." From that night on, their relationship blossomed. It wasn't long before they were spending most of their free time together. Sophia often stopped by his restaurant to surprise Michael during breaks, bringing a little spark of fun to his rigid schedule. She had a way of pulling him out of his work mode, making him relax and enjoy the moment, a skill Michael desperately needed. On weekends, they explored the city together, from the quiet bookstores lurking on side streets to the latest shows at art galleries. They found joy in the simplicity of spending time together. Whether they were sitting by the river with coffee in hand or wandering the local farmers' markets, discovering new ingredients for Michael to experiment with in the kitchen. Michael, who had always prided himself on being in control of his life, was pleased to find that next to Sophia, he was losing that control. She was spontaneous, unpredictable, and that delighted him. He was used to being structured, planning every detail of his day, but with her it was different. He didn't mind immersing himself in the world of her impromptu adventures. As the months went by, Michael realized he was falling in love. It wasn't just her laughter or playful spirit that attracted him. It was how she made him feel. With her, he could be himself, without pretense or pressure. She didn't care about his status or his wealth. She just liked him for who he was. The proposal came naturally, without further ado. One evening, as they cooked together in his apartment, Sophia playfully chopping vegetables and Michael fiddling with the stove, he looked at her and realized he didn't want to spend another day without her by his side. "I've been thinking," he said, turning to her with a smile. Sophia raised an eyebrow and looked at him. "Oh no, you have such a serious face. What's the matter?" Michael grinned, wiping his hands on a towel. "What if we make it permanent?" Sophia blinked, surprise reflected on her face. "Wait, you're proposing right now?" He laughed, feeling a little awkward. "Yeah, I guess I am. Not the most romantic setting, but..." Before he could finish, she put her arms around him and laughed so hard his heart raced. "Yes," she said, pulling away to look him in the eye. "Of course I do." Michael and Sophia's life after the proposal seemed like a dream come true. They married in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by friends and family, under the late autumn sun in a park just outside the city. Sophia looked stunning in her simple but elegant gown, and Michael couldn't believe how lucky he was to have her by his side. He had never felt more certain about anything in his life. Their honeymoon in Napa Valley was as perfect as it could be. They spent days exploring vineyards, indulging in gourmet meals, and walking hand in hand through the rolling hills of wine country. Michael, ever the culinary enthusiast, marveled at the farm-to-table experiences they shared, often taking mental notes of new ideas for his restaurant. But what mattered most was that he was with Sophia, and everything seemed right in the world. When they returned, their life together continued to flourish. Michael's restaurant was thriving more than ever, and the media began to take notice. Interviews, magazine features, and TV appearances followed. The praise was constant, and Michael was seen as a pioneer in the health food industry, bringing clean eating to the forefront of fine dining. With each new success, he felt a growing sense of pride, not just for himself, but for the life he was building with Sophia. At home, they started a family, which only deepened their bond. Their first child, Ava, was born just over a year after the wedding, and 2 years later, they welcomed their son, Jack. Parenthood was a whirlwind, but in the best possible way. Despite the challenges of running a booming restaurant and balancing the demands of fatherhood, Michael cherished every moment. Whether it was late-night feedings or early morning playtime, he loved being a dad. Sophia, too, seemed to settle naturally into her role as a mother. She was caring, playful, and effortlessly kept the household running. Michael often joked that she had more energy than anyone he'd ever met, managing to juggle the kids, freelance design work, and still have time to plan spontaneous weekend getaways. Their home, a beautifully renovated townhouse in one of the city's historic districts, was filled with laughter and warmth. Yet, as perfect as everything appeared on the surface, there were signs, small ones, that something had shifted in Sophia. Michael, always preoccupied with the demands of his restaurant and his growing fame, didn't immediately notice. But the subtle changes were there, like small cracks in a once pristine facade. Sophia started to act differently in social settings. She introduced herself to people in ways that felt off to Michael, almost as though she was trying to impress them. She'd mention things about their life, Michael's success, the places they traveled, their beautiful home, as if she was putting on a show. She also began to drop casual comments about other men. Nothing direct, but comparisons that stung. She'd joke about how someone else had a better car, or lived in a nicer neighborhood, or how a friend's husband had more free time to spend with his family. At first, Michael brushed it off. He was too busy running the restaurant, planning expansions, and focusing on his new cookbook deal to think much of it. But as time went on, the comments became more frequent. "You know, John just bought his wife a new car," she'd say over dinner one evening. "Must be nice, right?" Michael looked up from his plate, a little caught off guard. "I mean, if they can afford it, sure. But we're doing just fine." "Of course," Sophia replied quickly, with that same disarming smile. "It's just, wouldn't it be nice to treat yourself a little? You work so hard, but sometimes it feels like we don't enjoy the fruits of it as much as we could." Michael forced a laugh, dismissing the conversation. But it stuck with him. He had always thought they were happy, that they were living the life they had both dreamed of. Why did Sophia feel the need to compare their life to others? What was missing? The comments didn't stop there. Over time, they became sharper, more targeted. Sophia started to drop hints about how Michael wasn't spending enough time at home, how other men she knew were more involved with their kids. She'd mention old friends and how their lives seemed so much more exciting, more spontaneous. Michael started to feel the weight of her dissatisfaction, but instead of confronting it, he doubled down on his work. He thought that by succeeding even more, by pushing the restaurant to new heights, he could make everything right. After all, it wasn't like he was ignoring her on purpose. He was providing for their family, building a future. To make up for the tension, he showered her with gifts, jewelry, weekend trips, anything to remind her that he cared. But it wasn't working. No matter what he did, Sophia seemed distant, as if she were living in a world that he couldn't quite reach. One evening, after an exhausting day at the restaurant, Michael came home to find Sophia in the living room, scrolling through her phone with a thoughtful expression on her face. "You okay?" he asked, dropping his keys on the counter and walking over to her. Sophia looked up, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Michael sat down next to her, sensing something was off. He wanted to ask her more, to dig deeper, but something in her expression told him to leave it alone. Instead, he leaned over and kissed her forehead, hoping that the gesture would be enough. "Maybe we should take a vacation soon," he suggested. "Get away from the city for a bit. Just the two of us." Sophia nodded, but her eyes remained distant. "Maybe, Michael let it go, telling himself that things would improve. They always had before. He just needed to work harder to make sure his success at work translated into happiness at home. But deep down, a part of him knew that something was changing, and not for the better. As much as Michael tried to ignore the growing distance between him and Sophia, it was becoming impossible to deny it. The small cracks that had once seemed insignificant were growing deeper, and though he continued to work harder at work, give more lavish gifts, and plan impromptu trips, nothing seemed to bridge the gap. Sophia was slipping away, and Michael felt helpless to stop it. Life at Mykoa's restaurant became more stressful than ever. Michael was in the process of expanding and opening a second location, something he had dreamed of for years. The media was constantly getting attention. Michael was booked for interviews and public appearances, showcasing his specialties and promoting healthy, sustainable eating. It was his passion, his goal, and for a while it was enough to sustain him. But lately, with each new success, he felt like something was missing. Sophia had grown colder. She no longer showed up at the restaurant to surprise him or ask him how his day was going. Their once playful conversations had turned into short exchanges about logistics, about the kids, about errands that needed to be run. The laughter they once shared now seemed like a distant memory. Late one night, after a particularly exhausting day, Michael's life took an unexpected turn. He came home to an empty house. The kids were at a sleepover, and Sophia hadn't mentioned her plans for the evening, but she wasn't home. Michael didn't give it much thought at first. Perhaps she had gone to a friend's house or on business. But as he sat down at the kitchen table, an unusual sense of unease swept over him. Something was wrong. He looked around, and his gaze fell on her cell phone, carelessly left on the kitchen counter. It didn't look like she'd left it unattended. Michael had never been inclined to invade Sophia's privacy, but at this moment a strange, unwavering curiosity gripped him. He picked up the phone. His hands trembled as he unlocked it. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but something in his insides told him there was more to Sophia's recent behavior than just stress or fatigue. And then he saw the text messages, long and intimate, between Sophia and someone named David. David. The realization of it made Michael's stomach churn. It wasn't just David, it was David, his close friend and longtime colleague in the restaurant business. They had worked side by side for years, collaborating on projects, spending late nights in the kitchen, and discussing plans to grow the restaurant empire. David was one of the few people Michael trusted completely. But now, as Michael read the texts, his world was crumbling around him. The texts revealed everything. Their secret meetings, declarations of love, detailed plans to meet when Michael would be busy at work. Sophia and David had been dating for months, and they were using the very time Michael was building his business for both of them to continue their affair. Betrayal hit Michael like a freight train. His vision blurred as he scrolled through the messages, and the words cut deeper than any wound he'd ever experienced. How could this have happened? How could David, of all people, do this to him? How could Sophia? Michael felt physically sick, the walls of his once perfect life closing in around him. The woman he had loved so deeply, the woman he had built his life with, was now nothing more than a stranger to him. And David, a friend he trusted in both business and friendship, was part of it all, sharing intimate moments with Sophia at the very restaurant where they'd built their careers together. He didn't know how long he sat like that, staring at the screen, numb with shock. His thoughts darted around looking for answers that weren't there. How could he have missed the signs? How had it happened right under his nose? Sophia returned home late at night, completely unaware that her world was about to come crashing down. She walked into the house, tossing her purse on a chair, and looked up to see Michael sitting at the kitchen table. "Hey, is everything okay?" she asked in a neutral, almost disinterested tone. Michael slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a long time he said nothing, just watched her as if she were someone he never knew. Finally, he put the phone down on the table. Sophia's face flooded with color when she saw what appeared on the screen. The realization came instantly, and for a split second, she looked like a deer caught in the headlights. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened and she straightened as if preparing for an impending storm. "Michael," she began, but he interrupted her. Don't, he said quietly, his voice shaking with anger and pain. Don't you dare try to explain. Sophia closed her mouth, her eyes darting between him and the phone, searching for something, anything to say. But the truth was out in the open, and there was no getting it back. The silence between them was suffocating. How long? Michael finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia hesitated, then sighed. A few months. Michael clenched his fists, trying to contain the wave of rage building up inside him. With David? With my friend? With the man I worked with every day? With the man I trusted? His voice was getting louder, getting angrier. Do you have any idea what you've done? Sophia was silent, her face unreadable. She knew she'd been caught, and making excuses was pointless. I trusted you, Michael said, his voice cracking. I trusted both of you. I worked hard for this family, for this life, and this is what you were doing behind my back. Sophia's lips parted, but she said nothing. There was nothing she could say to remedy the situation. Michael stood up from the table, pushing his chair back so hard that it scraped across the floor. His heart was pounding in his chest, and all he wanted to do was get out of the house, get away from the woman who had destroyed everything he believed in. I'm done, he said coldly, grabbing his coat. I'm leaving. I need to think. Before Sophia could respond, Michael ran out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, but it didn't clear his thoughts. The betrayal was too fresh, too sharp. He'd lost not only his wife, but a friend he considered family. As he walked through the quiet streets, questions swarmed in Michael's mind. What should he do now? How to resist the destruction of the life he had worked so hard to build? He had no answers yet, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed were a blur for Michael. The initial shock of the betrayal numbed him, leaving him adrift in a sea of anger, confusion, and overwhelming sadness. He hadn't returned home that night. Instead, he spent hours wandering the city streets, trying to wrap his head around what had happened. When the sun began to rise, he found himself at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, too drained to do anything but collapse onto the bed. His phone buzzed constantly, texts and missed calls from Sophia, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. He didn't have the energy to confront her again, not yet. The betrayal had left a gaping hole in his chest, one that no conversation could mend. The next few days, Michael went through the motions. He continued to work at his favorite restaurant. Even though he was a spark of passion he once had for it seemed to have disappeared. Being in the kitchen, surrounded by the team he had built, only reminded him of David, the man who had stood beside him in the trenches, only to betray him in the worst possible way. It felt as though everything had been tainted, even the food that he had once poured his heart into. The world outside moved on as though nothing had changed, but for Michael, everything had. The expansion of the restaurant, once a dream that consumed him, now felt meaningless. His business partner had become his worst enemy. The restaurant he had built, his pride and joy, now felt like a prison. Every corner filled with memories of friendship, of laughter, of trust that had been shattered. His family, too, had been fractured beyond recognition. He still hadn't spoken to Sophia, and the thought of facing his children felt unbearable. How was he supposed to explain to Avo and Jack that their mother had broken their family? How could he, when he could barely process it himself? On the third day, Michael's sister, Jenny, came to visit him at the restaurant. She hadn't seen him since the night he stormed out, but she knew something was wrong. Michael had always been close to his sister. She was one of the few people who had seen him at his best and his worst, and she never held back when it came to calling him out. She found him in the back office, staring blankly at his computer screen. "Michael," she said softly, knocking on the door frame. "You okay?" He didn't look up, just continued staring at the screen, even though he wasn't reading anything. Jenny frowned, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "I heard from Sophia," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "She told me what happened." At that, Michael's eyes flicked up to meet hers, and the pain he had been holding back flooded to the surface. His shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the betrayal had finally crushed him. "I don't even know where to start, Jen," he said, his voice cracking. She's been seeing David. Of all people, David. My friend, my partner. Jenny's expression hardened. She had always been protective of her brother, and hearing this made her blood boil. Michael, I'm so sorry. I can't believe she did this to you. After everything you've given her, after everything you've built together. Michael swallowed hard, leaning back in his chair. I thought I was doing everything right. I was building a future for us, for the kids. I was working so hard, and I thought she understood that. But now I see that she was slipping away, and I didn't even notice. I should have. Don't do that, Jenny interrupted, her voice sharp. This isn't your fault. Don't sit here blaming yourself for what she did. Sophia made a choice, and so did David. This is on them, not you. Michael wanted to believe her, but the guilt gnawed at him. How had he missed the signs? Why hadn't he seen this coming? Had he been too wrapped up in the restaurant, in the success he thought they were both working toward? I just don't know what to do now, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Do I walk away? Do I forgive her for the kids? How do I even face them? Jenny pulled up a chair and sat beside him, placing a hand on his arm. You have to take care of yourself first. This betrayal, it's not something you can just sweep under the rug for the sake of keeping the family together. You deserve better than that, Michael. And so do Ava and Jack. You need to figure out what you need, what will make you whole again. Her words struck a chord. Michael knew deep down that he couldn't just forgive Sophia and pretend everything was okay. The trust had been destroyed, and no amount of apologies could undo the damage that had been done. That evening, Michael returned home for the first time since the night he discovered the affair. The house was quiet, too quiet. Sophia was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red from crying. She looked up when Michael entered, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. Finally, Michael broke the silence. We need to talk. Sophia nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Michael, I'm so sorry. He held up a hand to stop her. Don't. I don't want to hear apologies right now. I don't want to hear excuses. I just want to understand why. Why did you do this? Why David? Sophia wiped at her tears, her voice trembling. I don't know, Michael. I don't have a good answer for you. I was feeling lost, like I wasn't important to you anymore, like we weren't connected the way we used to be. And David, he was there. I know that doesn't make it right, but it's what happened. Michael shook his head, the anger bubbling back up. So you were feeling lost, and instead of talking to me, you go behind my back with my friend? Do you know how insane that sounds? Sophia looked down at her hands, unable to meet his gaze. I know I've ruined everything, Michael. I know that. But I don't want to lose you. I love you. Michael's heart clenched at her words, but he didn't trust them. Not anymore. He had heard them before, and they had been lies. The woman he had fallen in love with, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And there was no coming back from that. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Sophia, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can look at you the same way after this. And I don't know if we can fix this. Sophia stood, moving toward him, her tears flowing freely. Please, Michael, don't say that. Don't give up on us. I'll do anything to make this right. Michael stepped back, the space between them feeling like an ocean. I think you've done enough, Sophia. I need time to figure out what's next. And with that, he turned and walked toward the door. The sound of Sophia's sobs echoed behind him, but Michael didn't stop. He couldn't. This wasn't something that could be fixed overnight, or maybe not at all. Weeks passed, and the dust from Michael's broken marriage began to slowly settle. After that last confrontation with Sophia, he hadn't come home. Instead, he'd rented an apartment on the other side of town, a small place where he could think, breathe, and decide what to do next. The space was like a blank canvas. Nothing flashy, just enough to remind him that his life, despite the pain, wasn't over yet. There was still a future waiting for him, even if it wasn't what he had envisioned. The divorce papers were filed shortly thereafter. Sophia didn't argue with him about the terms. She knew that what had been done could not be undone. The betrayal was too deep, and although they both tried to keep things civil for the sake of the children, the once solid foundation of their relationship had crumbled beyond repair. As for David, he had quietly left town. Michael hadn't heard from him since the incident, nor did he need to. He'd made it clear that their friendship was over, and David, to his credit, hadn't tried to make excuses. The man who had once been Michael's closest friend was now a ghost from his past, a painful reminder of a trust broken in the worst possible way. Michael found himself in a strange in-between space. He was still a successful chef, still at the root of his restaurant, but his heart no longer lay with it. Every corner of the restaurant reminded him of the time he'd spent building it with David. The expansion plans that had once thrilled him now seemed empty. For a while, Michael considered leaving the restaurant altogether. But something kept him going. Something reminded him that his restaurant wasn't just his past. It was his passion, his love of food, and the community he had created because of it. Gradually, Michael began to refocus. He stepped away from the public spotlight and took the time to reconnect with the reasons he originally opened the restaurant. It wasn't about fame or success, but the simple joy of bringing good, wholesome food to people. He started spending more time in the kitchen again, working with his team, rethinking dishes, and finding that spark he thought he had lost. Outside of work, Michael began to rebuild his personal life. He spent more time with his children, Ava and Jack, who had handled the breakup with their husband more resiliently than he expected. At first, he worried that they would be devastated by the separation, but they seemed to understand him in their own way. The evenings spent with them brought him comfort, whether it was cooking their favorite meals or helping them with their homework. These moments reminded Michael of what really mattered. Despite Sophia's attempts to reach out to him, apologize, and find a way to save their relationship, Michael stood his ground. He knew it wasn't about forgiveness anymore. It was about learning to let go of the past and realizing that some wounds can't heal no matter how much time passes. The love they once shared was real, but it had also turned into something toxic that no amount of effort could save them from. One evening, after picking up the kids from Sophia's house, she tried again. She stood in the doorway with tears in her eyes and asked Michael in a trembling voice if he would ever consider a second chance. But this time Michael didn't feel the usual feelings of insecurity or guilt. Instead, he felt a strange sense of peace. "Sophia," he said quietly, "we both made the choices that led us to this moment. I'm not angry anymore, but I can't go back. Too much has happened, and I don't think we can rebuild what we had." Sophia wiped her eyes and nodded, as if finally coming to terms with the truth. I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything." Michael smiled sadly. "I know you are, and I hope you find what you're looking for. But I'm moving forward." That was the last time Sophia tried to reach out. In the months that followed, Michael found himself drawn to new experiences and new people. It wasn't until he met Erin, a woman he first encountered at a local farmer's market, that he realized he was ready to open his heart again. Erin was different from Sophia in every way, calm, poised, and quietly passionate about sustainable farming. Their relationship blossomed slowly, without the whirlwind intensity that had characterized his past. Instead, hello, you're on the Storm to Truth channel. Enjoy your watching. Michael has always been a man who strives for order. As the owner and chef of a popular restaurant, one of the most famous health food restaurants in the city, his days were filled with careful planning, precision, and passion. He was a self-made millionaire who became famous in the culinary world not only for his dishes, but also for his commitment to healthy eating and sustainability. People respected him, chefs, critics, and customers alike. But today, as he sat in a quiet corner of a local bar after a long day, he wasn't thinking about recipes or his next big venture. His thoughts were far away from here. There was a familiar hum in the bar. The clinking of glasses, the quiet murmur of conversation, and occasional bursts of laughter provided a cozy backdrop for Michael, who had chosen a window seat. He didn't come here to be noticed. It was his way to relax, to let the weight of the day dissolve into the amber glow of the evening. His restaurant might have been a success, but Michael was a man who treasured these moments of solitude, when no one demanded anything of him, when he could just breathe. He didn't notice her at first, but she must have been sitting nearby. His thoughts were disturbed by her laughter. Soft at first, then louder. It sounded like it was coming from someone who didn't take life too seriously. He looked around and saw her. Sophia. Her presence was impossible to ignore. Her dark hair framed her face in waves, and her smile seemed to catch the light in the room. She wasn't loud or trying to draw attention to herself, but people noticed her anyway. Michael couldn't help but smile when he saw how animated she was talking to the bartender. It was her energy, infectious, full of life, that drew him in. Before he knew it, their eyes met, and she smiled at him in a way that made his heart race. "Rough day?" she asked, dropping into the seat next to him without hesitation. It felt like they'd known each other for years, not